Welcome back and thank all of you. We're very pleased to today in this celebration of Dred Scott to bring another group of legacies, people who have a really amazing history to tell, and you will hear it from them, but you'll also see what has been the documentary that's being prepared that will be released later this year to celebrate these great Americans for what they've survived. I'll do these in reverse order. The last person you'll hear from is Reggie Turner. Reggie's a classmate of mine from Stanford University, a Georgetown Law Center law graduate. He's been an entrepreneur, a sports agent, and many other successful business ventures. And one of his new passions is documentaries, and he has been trailing these survivors and those who participate in the case for more than 2 years now, documenting much of what has occurred. You will just see a trailer, not the entire piece. 3 years? 3 years now. But you'll get a sense of what has occurred since this case came into existence several years ago. You will also hear from Eric Miller. He's a professor at St. Louis University. He's a former research assistant of mine, a law clerk to Judge Steve Reinhardt from the Ninth Circuit. I also clerked in federal courts, as well as being a fellow here at Harvard Law School, where he got his LLM, and has taught a wide variety of areas, but has been really one of the principal lawyers in helping to develop the litigation on behalf of the Tulsa race riots survivors and others. Then you'll hear second, descending order, from Wess Young, who is 91 years old, one of the survivors who was alive in 1921 with his family when everything they had was destroyed, and he'll talk about that. And finally, you'll hear first from Otis Clark, who was 18 years old, and he's been telling this story since 1921. As I said before, he turned 104 years old on February 13th. That in and of itself it's very interesting. You can tell the sort of male challenge here. Every time he's explained his age, I see men my age and older saying, gosh, I need to go back to the gym, I need to do something, right? So he's assigned. And it's much harder for Mr. Clark to remember these issues because he's been talking about them for 90 years. It's been a very, very long time, but he's still speaking truth to power to make sure that we all appreciate what occurred and how important it is. I'm going to ask him a few questions to try to elicit a little bit about what happened in Tulsa on May 31st, 1921. The area he's going to be talking about is called Greenwood. It's a Black Wall Street. It's 3 main streets, Greenwood, Archer, and Pine. You've ever heard of the Gap Band? The Gap Band, yes you have. The Gap Band's from Tulsa, and the Gap Band stands for Greenwood, Archer, and Pine. You've heard that song, You Dropped the Bomb on Me? That's not to shake your behind. That's what happened in Tulsa in 1921. It is really a remarkable story, and they are survivors of that. When we started this case, as you will see, there were 150. Why do I always do this? Well, let me get to Otis Clark. Okay. And we will get a sense of what has happened in just the last 4 years. Mr. Clark, let me ask you first if you can take us back to May 31st, 1921, and tell this audience a little bit about that community. What was Greenwood like when you were a young lad there in Tulsa, Oklahoma?
To the best of my ability, I will tell you this, that we had quite an amazing little city. We had everything down on Greenwood, which comes up to Archie, and Archie was the first street on the north side of the Frisco train track. On the north side was Greenwood and Archie, and on the south side of the the railroad, which was the Frisco Railroad that crossed the city, coming from Kansas City over to Oklahoma City, was a Frisco train track, and the Frisco train. And back there, we didn't have airplanes and buses. Trains was the only thing that were used back in those days, around 19 and that would be around 19 and says around about 1915 on up to 1921. We only used trains crossing our little city from Kansas City to Oklahoma City. And we had what you might Pullman cars and that would be in sleeping cars and dining cars, and that was the way we traveled back in those days. But on our Greenwood side and Archie, which was my parents' home, was on Archie Street, which was the main little street that crossed Tulsa at that particular time. Archie was one of our main little streets. And the colored lived on the, on the east side of Archie, and the whites was on the, the west side. And on the south side, the tracks, at that time, we had what you might say is sporting folks. And the sporting folks, and they had what you might say is everything that they wanted to have. And wasn't no law back there against it. And so we had what you might say is an amazing little city. It was an oil state. Oklahoma at that particular time was the oil, and little Tulsa was the oil capital of the world. And a lot of us in those days had the privilege to be with the Indian folks. Me and the Indian folks, we lived pretty highly. Back there, we had our 12-cylinder Packards, 12 cylinders, and our fine cars, and we was getting along nicely. We didn't have no paved roads, though. We had gravel roads, and we didn't have paved roads. They didn't even know how to make paved roads at that time. We had our nice gravel roads, and we rode our Cadillac cars and whatnot up down them, what you might say is paved, gravel roads. And so we was kind of blessed on Archie Street and Greenwood Street. We had our little theaters, and back there we only had what you might say is written information on the pictures. Mm-hmm. We didn't have no talkies back there then. Everything was in the writings, and we had Clark Gable and Charlie Chaplin and Step and Fetch It and all of these leading movie stars. And tell the truth about it, I got on to some of that. And I got on the movie star side. Help us, Lord. And I served Clark Gable and Charlie Chaplin and Step and Fetch It. And I got with them, and I found out that they had the best life. They had a little better life than what we had in Tulsa. But after all said and done, God was good to us. Even after our little city got burnt down, a lot of us was able to stay out, and regardless of what the folks says, the Lord blessed us to stay in Tulsa and be blessed. And tell the truth about it, the folks had little oil, little Tulsa. Around Tulsa was the oil capital of the world, as I've said. And we lived pretty high there. But all around us was kind of a bad news. But we lived so well until the folks got jealous. Some Arkansas folks and Mississippi folks kind of got jealous of us and started a race riot. And in our race riot, the whites had the advantage of us. Some of our colored boys had come back from the army, but they had little guns but no loads. Nothing to use. So whites come in and they from Arkansas and Mississippi and around, and we were living so well, getting along with us colored and Indians who were running to Oklahoma then. But rich folks had oil wells, but they paid us well. And we, little boy said, we live highly. And we had our own little theater. We had our theaters and our little drinking bars and whatnot and soup. So yeah, we got along pretty good on Greenwood. On Greenwood, on the little town Greenwood. And at that time, our biggest privilege was going to the show. And, let me see. We had, say we had little movie shows, but they didn't. And but in our little movie shows, they didn't have anything but what you might say is writings. They didn't have no talkies back there then.
And Mr. Young, let me ask you, you have talked about this being a very young child and your sense of what happened on May 31st, before May 31st, your family and what was going on. Mr. Young, tell us about you in 1921. And you have to get closer to the microphone too, Mr. Young.
Okay.
You can sit down. You can sit down. Oh, there you go.
Sit down. Just get a little closer, Mike. I was born in Madill, Oklahoma in
Get a
1970.
little closer, Colin.
In
A
1917.
little closer.
And my mother and father moved to Tulsa, Oklahoma around 1919, somewhere along that. My sister was 11, she was 6 years older than I was. And I was 4 years old. I had passed my 4th birthday. But what I'm going to tell you about is what my mother and my sister told me. And I believed them because they didn't have no reason to tell me a lie about nothing, because it was my mother and sister. And they told about the race riot, how it started and how it progressed on up to, see, the race riot was over in about 12 hours. The race riot started around 2 o'clock in the morning, and around 12 o'clock that evening, the Oklahoma National Guard's troops came in and taken over. And they put our area under military law. And they were arresting all young men, and they taking them out to the fairground, what you call the Tulsa Fairgrounds. And I imagine it was 1,000 or 2,000, just blacks. And the Red Cross furnished us with blankets and carts, and we stayed there about 4 or 5 weeks. Well, we could come back over Tulsa town, Black Town, what you call it. That other word, the N word, some people get offended by it, but I do not. See, I know I'm not a nigger. I'm a black man, and I'm not a nigger because I respect my elders. I respect my mother. And I was raised in a Christian surrounding, but I kind of grew out of it. If I got 12 and 14 years old, I kind of went off on my own, which was a big mistake. See, about 18 or 20 years of my life just wasted doing what I thought I wanted to do. And I wasn't benefiting me, wasn't benefiting anybody I know. It was, this is what you can do now, you grown. Go on and do this, go on and do that. But get back on to the race route part. It started like, the first thing that happened, the city had been already kind of a boiling pot. And this one evening, a young lady, she was an elevator operator, and it was about a 10-story building. Well, the blacks was working there in the building. They had to go up to the 10th floor to use the bathroom. And so this young man got on the elevator, and he went up to the 10th floor, and she came back down and said, that black boy touched me on my fanny. That's what started. And she recanted that about 3 or 4 years after, but all the damage was done, and she recanted it. And the Ku Klux Klan wanted to lynch this. The word had got out that the Ku Klux Klan was going to lynch this young man. And like Mr. Clark said, it was pretty, well, in 1917, we just got out of the World War, and some of the blacks had some guns. See, all prior to that time, blacks wasn't allowed to have a firearm under no other circumstances. He might have been a county sheriff. He couldn't arrest a white man. And he only had, his area was in the black part of town, so they didn't think he needed a gun or anything. So, but right after the war, some of the black soldiers got out of World War I, and they kept their guns and ammunitions, because in those days, you didn't know when somebody was going to come kick your door down and take your dad away, or take your mother away, or take your brother away. Oh, you had to stand there, you didn't have nothing to defend yourself with. You either had to stand there and look at them do it or run like the devil. Try to help yourself. So, but at this particular time, 15 or 20 young black men decided, say, we're not going to let the Ku Klux Klan lynch this young man. And they went up to the county jail, which was on 5th and Boulder. And that particular day, after this guy had been arrested, well, all of the deputies and things that hang around the jailhouse, they had to go fishing, they had to go out of town, they had to leave, and they left one guard and this whole jailhouse with this young black man, and the Ku Klux Klan let it get out. Said, we're going to take him out and lynch him tonight as soon as the sun go down. Well, but just before the sun went down, these 20 guys went up to the jailhouse and asked the jailer, said, can we give you some help? Said, you're going to need some help. Said, there's a rumor running around that the Ku Klux Klan's going to lynch this young man. And we don't think he need to be lynched because he hadn't had a trial and whatever they said. And so the guard said, no, I don't need no help, so I can take care of this black so-and-so, such and that. Well, while they were there, a mob came up to the jail to get him out. And they had a confrontation there that the blacks said, well, you're not going to take him out of jail. Say, he's going to stay in jail and go to trial. So in the meantime, while they was arguing, they slipped this black guy out of town. And they taking them about 9 miles west of Tulsa, which is Sandy Springs. And they hid him out there. Well, when the two sides met together up on Fifth and Boulder, well, some of the blacks had guns, and they said, we're going to use it. So you're going to have to go over us. Well, that kind of stopped the Ku Klux Klan. They said, what are we going to do now? And some kind of way, there was one shot fired at that meeting, and it didn't hit anybody, anything. Well, the blacks said they had stopped it, so they went on back down North Greenwood with it, and it was, I don't know if you've seen some cowboy pictures when they capture a town or do something, they go around and fire shots in the air. And they did that, I guess, a couple of hours, and I guess they came to realize, say, well, we ain't shooting at nothing but up in the air. Say, what if we gonna need this ammunition later on? Because the Ku Klux Klan was very efficient. If they said we was gonna come to your house and do something to your dad, you could bet on it. They would do it if he was black. Not only black, but if he was even poor white people, so they called it. See, it wasn't just the blacks that the Ku Klux Klan was about. They hated the blacks, the Jews, and the poor white folk. But getting back to on Greenwood, when the blacks were shooting up their ammunition, it must have came to them and said, well, we're just shooting in the air. Say, we're not doing anything to protect our land if they would come, which they did. So they stopped. Everything got quiet around 12 o'clock. And about 2:30, 3 o'clock in the morning, it goes pow, pow, pow. Guns, it was shooting over on Greenwood. Now, the Greenwood was kind of a boundary area, was on the east side, it was split. The railroad track went north. The Midland Valley track went north. Mm-hmm. The Santa Fe and the Frisco went east till it got out of town, and then they wavered north. But anyway, it was kind of a gully where the track split up. And unbeknownst to the blacks, these Ku Klux Klans and whatnot, they had went to the city peoples and the hardware places where they sold the guns and gun dealers. Well, they just was giving them out to whites, say, go out there and kill your nigger. And that is literally what happened. Because the blacks didn't have anything to defend themselves, so they moved back. Me and my mother and about 800 or 900, maybe 1,000 people stopped at the Booker Washington High School, which it was city property. And they said they're not going to touch the city property. And they didn't. They didn't bother us when we were there. And another building where some blacks stayed was the Tulsa Convention Center. Not the Tulsa Convention Center, but what's the name of that place? The nickname is Old Lady Brady. It was a place where they held plays and different things. It wasn't an opera house, but it's got a name, but I can't think of it right on the tip of my tongue.
Convention Hall.
Convention Hall. Yeah, Convention Hall. And so it was, I guess, about, just my estimation, how many it could be was up there. I imagine 1,600 or so, and they stayed there, and they were safe, but the majority had to leave their home, had to get out of their home, and run for it, because the whites was coming through, and they was setting fire to all the buildings that the blacks owned: churches, restaurants, barber shops, pool halls, residential section. It was burnt to the ground. We didn't see a policeman. We didn't see the fire department. The only time we received any help was after they had gathered us up and taken us out to the fairgrounds. And during that time, the city was getting offers for money to come in to help the blacks, just like we did with 9/11, where so much money was sent in and that they didn't know what to do with it. But the city refused it. Don't say, no, you don't send us no money. Say, we'll take care of it. Don't send nothing here. Don't send nothing. They still taking care of it.
And the survivors, you did get one thing from the city, right?
No, we didn't get from the city. That was
Tell them what you got.
we got a medal. I bet it about that big around, gold-plated medal. It was brass or lead, as heavy as I don't know what. And I know it wasn't gold because it's too heavy.
It's brass. It's brass.
That's what we got from the Black Caucus of the Senate in Oklahoma. See,
Nothing from the city, nothing from the state, and nothing from the government.
And we had lawyers in that day. They made an attempt to file a suit against the city, but it was put off. See, now a lot of people lost their homes that they had them insured. See, the insurance company, they had pictures of the houses, just the way they was on the streets, who stayed there and who had insurance on the houses. But that didn't help them any. See, the insurance company had a clause in there in case of riot, war, natural disaster, the policy was canceled. And see, so, but the few blacks that stayed there, they said, well, we're not going to leave. We're going to go back and do what we can. And I think it taken them like 2 months to clean off the debris for you to come back and prepare to build. And I don't know exactly how they identified the people to give them their property back, unless they went through the insurance companies and did it. And the people they say, well, we're going to stay here. And they started building back. The route was in May of 21. And in 1922, they had built back brick businesses, brick houses, 2 and 3 story brick, all through the Greenwood section. And it went from there until 1947, I think. And then the city and the government put a freeway across it. And that's what started us going back down. And that's the way it looks now. It's in bad shape.
Thank you very much, Mr. Clark and Wess Young, for telling us your story. Eric Miller will just take a couple of minutes to talk a little bit about the legal strategy, and then Reggie will introduce the trailer we're going to show before we break.
When we first filed this case, we had 125 survivor clients. That is 125 people still alive in 2003. 151 when we did the amended complaint. 151, I should know that because I wrote out all those names one by one. In fact, Wess Young is my favorite name because he's alphabetically the last person on the complaint, and so I always knew that I'd finished making that list when I got to Mr. Young's name. 151 survivor clients, and today there are 84 still living. That's 4 years, just over 4 years. And it's clear that the government's strategy, the state of Oklahoma, the city of Tulsa, has been to wait out the survivors. And, it's an obvious and simple strategy. Now, there's a lot of things we could talk about in relation to the Tulsa race riot. Some of it to do with the lawyer as historian, the lawyer as the teller of a narrative, maybe talk about theories of reparations, slavery reparations versus Jim Crow reparations, and maybe, if you want, during the question and answer period, we can talk a little bit about that. But the litigation strategy, which Professor Ogletree developed and which he was very kind enough to bring me on board to help put into practice, and which was actually developed in this building. In fact, in a room on the mezzanine in this building, we spent months drafting that complaint, was relatively simple. What we wanted to do was make reparations, or find a reparations case that would present the issues that everyone said couldn't be presented in a concise and simple form. And so our goal was to find a reparations-style case that focused solely on the statute of limitations and managed to frame everything else as essentially a 1983 lawsuit. Up till that point, reparations was talked about in terms of unjust enrichment or tort law. And I think the genius of Professor Ogletree was to reframe it as a Section 1983 lawsuit and focus like a laser beam on the statute of limitations issue. And Judge Lucero, who you heard from in the last panel, dissenting from the denial of rehearing on bank in the case Alexander versus Government of Oklahoma that we filed, said, and it was good to find that at least one of the judges got what we were trying to do, the trial court answered the wrong question by asking whether the exceptional circumstances, and I'll explain in a minute what that is, had changed. Rather, it should have asked whether the plaintiffs had pled a sufficient evidentiary basis about whether the exceptional circumstances persisted. And our theory of litigation was threefold: to suggest, first of all, that this case fit within the newly developing exceptional circumstances rationale for tolling statutes of limitations that was being developed in various district courts around the country in Holocaust reparations cases. And essentially that theory, as we put it, was if there was, the criteria are some kind of large-scale murder sponsored by a government, in this case the city and state government, designed to terrorize citizens and undermine the very existence of law itself so that going to court was a practical impossibility. That led to our second claim, which was an equitable estoppel claim, which was essentially that the government between 1921 and at the earliest 1923, the state of Oklahoma and the city of Tulsa, engaged in acts of intimidation that precluded lawyers from safely going to court. And when they did go to court, the few brave ones that actually made it there, they filed the claims away and never looked at them. I know that that's often a judicial strategy amongst district court lawyers, or district court judges when they hope that something will settle. In this case, it was burying the case completely. And then finally, to cover the time between essentially 1923 up till 2003, we argued equitable tolling. In other words, that the government had suppressed, had so effectively suppressed the evidence, and by the way, the state of Oklahoma passed a statute in 2003, suggesting that this is precisely what they did, that the government so effectively suppressed the evidence that a reasonably diligent plaintiff could not have discovered the information necessary to determine who to sue. And in particular, the issues of deputizing 500 white citizens on behalf of the local police force and whose instructions the local National Guard were following were suppressed and covered up for certainly 80 years until the state of Oklahoma formed a commission to look into the issues. If you're interested in an in-depth history of this, I strongly recommend Professor Al Brophy's book, Reconstructing the Dreamland. He's at the University of Alabama, and he's written a lot about this. But if, hopefully, Professor Ogletree will grant me a few more minutes of indulgence, I just want to explain why this was a significant lawsuit. Before this case, reparations followed a very different model, and the academic and legal cases thought of reparations in a very different way. And I think that it is Professor Ogletree's genius to reframe the reparations model in the way that he did. The purpose of, there's essentially three purposes I think we went into the case with. The first was academically and as a matter of legal theory to focus all the issues on the statute of limitations and then say to the government, state, local, and national, are you going to allow these people to go without recompense simply because of the passage of time? Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes said that statute of limitations works an evil. He then went to justify why that evil sometimes gets worked. And we wanted to say there are exceptional circumstances here that suggest that that evil cannot be justified. The second purpose of the case was to use it politically as a means of social change. First of all, to extend the concept of reparations to Jim Crow, but second of all, to get these claims before a federal court, in part because you see the power of personal testimony. I don't like to call Otis Clarke's discussion and Wes Young's discussion their stories. I think this is witness testimony. This is evidence. This is more than a story. This is the truth. Third, personally, to show these clients that America remembers and cares about them. And you'll see when you see the video that this is a deeply emotional case, and a lot of hard-nosed and otherwise detached lawyers get caught up in representing our clients. And that was a lesson that I didn't learn in a big law firm in LA, and I certainly learned when I came back here to work for Professor Ogletree. As with Dred Scott, the point in this case was not necessarily to win, but to get the claims before the court, to put the government to the test and have Oklahoma, Tulsa, and the courts say just where they stand so that it's on the record and we can point to it in the future. Two last things. Both the district court and the appellate court agreed that the rule of law ceased to exist in Oklahoma and that the courts were an extension of the mob and the Klan. If you're a criminal procedure person, this should remind you of Moore versus Dempsey, a case coming out of a similar riot in Elaine, Arkansas in 1919 that went up to the Supreme Court in 1923. So what this taught me is that Charles Hamilton Houston and Thurgood Marshall actually were not just lawyers, but they engaged in the same type of passive resistance to mob rule that Martin Luther King did. And it's the bravery of lawyers like them who blazed a trail for people like us became viscerally apparent in looking at this case. Second of all, getting this case off the ground was as much an intellectual and an academic achievement as a litigative one. And just as Charles Hamilton Houston would quote his mentor Dean Pound in his famous remark about lawyers and social engineers, using his academic talent to generate the blueprint for Brown versus Board of Education. I think we ought to appreciate Professor Ogletree's effort to frame this case in a way that presents reparations theories and draws upon a variety of different theories as not just a viable legal argument, but a viable intellectual argument. This is much an intellectual exercise as a litigative exercise. That's why I get on board. I'm not the world's best litigator. I don't claim to be the world's best intellect, but certainly it was a major intellectual challenge to get this off the ground. So I think that this case, while we didn't win, we certainly managed to, while we haven't won so far, we're before the Organization of American States currently, we certainly managed, I think, to forward each of those three goals. The major legacy of the case, as we've seen yesterday and today, I think is going to be an educative one. It is explaining to people, telling people who don't know what happened, to a country that is embarrassed about what happened and wants to cover up what happened, that this went on, not just in Tulsa, Oklahoma, but in Elaine, Arkansas, in Omaha, Nebraska, in Atlanta, Georgia, in Wilmington, North Carolina, in Detroit, Michigan, in Chicago, Illinois, in Springfield, Illinois. This is a part of our history from the end of the First World War through the Second World War. There are many more people like Otis Clarke and Wess Young, and we need to recognize and remember these individuals as Americans.
Thank you very much, Professor Miller. Reggie Turner will briefly introduce this 20-minute video that you'll see, then we'll break for lunch. All of the public guests will exit from this door to your right and go over to a pound for the lunch. It's ready to be served, and the speakers and panelists and judges and the special guests will go out this door to the Casperton room in the library for the lunch, and those will happen right after this trailer for the video. Everyone has to leave the room as soon as we finish because it has to be secured and examined before we come back.
Thank you, Charles. This is always, as Eric was alluding to, an emotional experience for those of us who've been involved with this case and these people for more than 4 years now. The trailer, now that's a misnomer. What you're going to see is about 30 minutes long. That's not a trailer. That's my challenge as a filmmaker to edit this story. We've shot over 150 hours of film following them throughout the courts, throughout the country as they've gone about trying to tell their story, trying to be heard. And I've now cut it, as of yesterday morning, down to, all right, I was going to lie, 3 hours. And our distribution deal requires that I get it down to 1 hour and 40 minutes, so I've still got plenty of work to do, and it doesn't help that I've got another couple of days of shooting. I say all of that to say that there is a wealth of information about this atrocity that has accumulated from 80 years of a conspiracy of silence. One of our most recent interviews, we found that many of the documents that the commission eventually used in their study were found only because they were remodeling the Tulsa police station, and as they tore down the walls, papers fell out from the remodeled walls. And as atrocious as that is, what is particularly painful is that what you people have heard today, what you'll see on the screen, has been and continues to be the only opportunity that these people have ever had to tell their story. They've not uttered a word in a courtroom. They've been denied the opportunity to tell their story, and they're prepared to deal with whatever the outcome was, but the outcome became that no one was interested in hearing it. the government has chosen to stand behind the statute of limitations, and I don't really believe that was the intent. But the application has been all of these other riots which Eric just enumerated, and I didn't count, but from our research we know of 19 documented racial riots. What you have to take away from that are, sitting in front of you, 2 of the surviving 84 from all of those riots. That's why this is so utterly important, that we address redressing these people before they die. The delays that have taken place have served to diminish the claimants. And I love Mr. Clark, I love Mr. Young, and all of the survivors. But what you have to understand is, and I say this directly in front of them, that's why I first told you about how much I love them, is that as sharp as they are right now, as impressed as you all have been, I always note the audience reaction to these people. They're not getting better. One of the most arduous things for me as I go through cutting this film is seeing and hearing their testimony of 4 years ago and comparing that to their ability to recall those facts now. The beauty of the film, or this project, is we have recorded over 50 interviews with the survivors. So their stories will not be lost. They may never be told in a courtroom, but in the court of public opinion, their stories and their voices will not be silenced. What you'll see now is a compilation of scenes from the film. As a filmmaker, I must say this again, this is not the movie. There is no movie yet. What you will see is we are in 2 film festivals this month. We will be making our official launch Memorial Day weekend for a lot of reasons, which we'll go into later, as the 86th anniversary of the riot. But what you will see now is a compilation of 4 years of work, and you will get the sense of the story and the loss that these people have incurred. And the film is really a call to action, because if we are going to do anything to right this wrong, it's going to be people like yourselves who are going to step up and do what reparations literally means: repair the damage. And that's the goal of the film. At the end of the film, we will talk about the plan and the strategies that we've put in place to allow the public to contribute directly to a fund that will go directly to the survivors. My position as a lawyer notwithstanding, because we've thrown that out the window with my frustration with where the legal system has led us, is to put on that other hat that I wear as an agent manager and to make a deal. And the deal that I'm making is I'm coming to the American public and asking you to do what our government has yet to do. Last thing I'll say before they start is forgive the quality of the film right now, because we had, using the latest technology, I just downloaded this on this laptop about 45 minutes ago. So it is really fresh from the studio. Charles has not seen it, so if you see him nervous and pacing, it'll be because he has no idea what's coming up on the screen. And I will probably be pacing too, because I've just seen it for the first time, And unlike you, I will notice all of the mistakes. So I apologize if it pixelates a little bit or some things aren't quite clear. We're in post-production, we're not finished. So I think that's enough apologies at this point. And if we'll dim the lights, we'd like to share with you our production of Before They Die.
Thank you, Reggie Turner.